My name is Larry Jackson and welcome to the J4BG Family Parenting Seminars. Today we're going to talk about value-based parenting, a way to help your child change their outcomes from the inside out. What is value-based parenting? Value-based parenting is a simplified way to help track your child's challenges and improvements over time. It's also a tool to help persuade your child to be the best person they can be. It's also a unique way to create an agreed upon value improvements between you and your child. This model here represents what I call the circle of influence. The circle of influence represents how we can help best influence our children by first dealing with core areas. The first core area is the relationship, or what I like to call family leadership. The relationship is simply this: is you establishing a relationship with your child that says, I care about you. Because I care about you, I have high expectations of you. Because I have high expectations of you, I'm going to be tough on you. And I'm going to be a little bit tough on you because I have high expectations of you, or because I care about you. And creating that circular model will allow you to be able to say the tough things sometimes, but also put your child in a position where they're more willing to respond to the request. The second circle within this ecosystem is value-based parenting, or what is the discipline structure. The key to this is teaching self-discipline. In other words, how do we teach our child how to self-regulate? It is more important for our children to self-regulate than to have external regulations imposed upon them. And that's a key element to my model. The last thing here we have is behavior. And so I want to backtrack a little bit here. When I'm working with the family, usually what they would like me to do is to deal strictly with behavior, address the behavior issue head on, and find out what's going on. And I say yes and no to that. I want to understand that. I want to deal with behavior, but I want to deal with it in relation to the relationship within the family, and also what is the discipline structure, and how can we adjust that so that when a child misbehaves, the boundaries that we've defined as far as a relationship and how we want them to self-regulate themselves is clear. Key approaches to this model is in the persuasion process. In other words, how do I persuade my child that the behavior issues that they're displaying are things that need to be corrected? The first thing I want to talk about is persuading versus teaching values. Teaching is important, and teaching values is important, but it is more important to put the child in a position where they're teaching themselves those values rather than to outright call them out and make them accountable based on what I say. And so my theory is that we can effectively persuade our children to develop a value system from their perspective, in their own words, or if we can effectively persuade our children to develop a value system from their perspective, they'll not only take ownership of the action, but they'll adjust their behavior at a faster pace. The other approach that I have to this model is we're helping our child develop inner conscience. That inner voice is so important. And so what I want to do is I want to persuade my child to identify what issues that they have themselves. I want their own voice to talk to themselves about their own behavior. My theory is that if I can get a child to talk to themselves and to process and to deal with themselves about their own behavior, that they're more apt to take ownership of it. In other words, if I give them the control, oftentimes we as parents, we want to distribute all this authority and control, but we forget to allow the child to develop that self-awareness on their own. So we want a child to be curious and engaged about their own behavior on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And I want to reiterate that setting a behavioral recovery plan, we're dealing with consequences. In other words, how do we help you get back? What if something happens, then there's got to be a plan in place to help get you back on track. So it looks a little bit like consequences or discipline, but we want to label consequence and discipline differently, so that our child understands that our intent is to help them recover and not to punish them. That is key there. Our intent, when we provide discipline, or when we punish when we discipline our child, the intent is to help them recover and to get back on track and not to punish them. Once they see that come from us, they're more apt to self-regulate based on that pattern. And stage 5 is behavioral recovery plan. Putting and implementing a behavioral recovery plan for when they are not able to follow through on things. Now, our behavioral recovery plan looks somewhat like a consequence, but it's not. The intent is to help your child bounce back. Oftentimes, we put the consequence in place, but we never explain the purpose of having a consequence. And so what it feels like to the child is punishment. That if I don't do the right things, that I'm going to go through torture. That's not necessarily what we want to impose upon our children. What we want them to do is to say, okay, if you make a mistake, then how do you bounce back? If you can acknowledge that you made a mistake, then how do you bounce back? Now, if a child will not admit they made a mistake and they're making mistakes in the household, but they won't admit it, then there's obvious consequences that they're just not going to understand. It's going to feel like somebody's punishing me. But we want to avoid at all costs going the punishment route. What we want to do instead is we want to deal with the discipline side and say, how can I not only teach you discipline, but how can I teach you self-discipline? So for this activity, which behavioral challenge does your child struggle with the most? We say create a response activity to help your child recover from that behavioral challenge. So the next step here, before we talk about proactive activities, we're going to talk about proactive versus reactive parenting. Now, we all know that parenting is an art form. However, there are certain things that should be followed, and there are certain things we should probably put on the back burner and look at a little bit more. We're going to talk about two concepts here, proactive and reactive parenting. Let's deal with reactive first. Reactive is the spur-of-the-moment reactions that you have to your child when they misbehave. You know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you pat them on the butt, or it's that knee-jerk reaction without thinking, disciplined response to when your child behaves. It is sporadic, and most importantly, it is emotional. And I tell parents, and I'll tell you, that you have to take your emotion out of the parenting process. Because you don't want a child to improve their behavior just to make you feel better. And if you're injecting your emotion while you're parenting, that's essentially what you're telling your child. Is that their behavior regulation is so that they can make you feel better. We want to eliminate that. We want kids to improve their behavior because it is the right thing to do. Because it will make them feel better in the long run. So we want to reverse that cycle. So the way we do that is through proactive parenting. In other words, we want to be aware of how we parent, and we want to be aware of what are our child's challenges in advance. And so proactive parenting is a planned course of action to help combat adolescent predictable behavioral challenges. Everything that your child is doing right now, they're probably going to do 2 months from now if you don't deal with it. As a matter of fact, for the next 2 months, I can promise you that about a good 80% of what your child does can be predicted, for the most part. Because we know our children. We know what they're apt to do. We know it. As a matter of fact, they know it too. So because we know that, we can set up a plan to help them circumvent those things in advance, long before the temptation or the challenge arises. So proactive parenting, a controlled verbal and emotional response to child. And so when we look at their behavior that we know that they display all the time, what we want to do is set in our mind how we're going to react to that behavior in advance. What that'll help you do is it'll help you have a sincere relationship with your child. And it'll help not only build a relationship with them, but it will also help them see their behavior for themselves and not based on how you see it. This process of proactive parenting requires practice, repetition, and consistency. Now they all look like the same word there, but understand that you have to put into practice what you preach. Not only for them, but for yourselves. You want to repeat it as often as possible. And then consistency is the long haul. In other words, you want to endure, you want to create this lasting, if you want to create this lasting impact on your child, you want to make sure that you are following through and you're creating a certain amount of consistency in how you approach their behavior or misbehavior.